A quiet black passenger boards a first-class train, but faces humiliation from passengers and staff who believe that he is not one of them. But when the train suddenly breaks down, the very person they bullied gets on it, and what follows stuns everyone. Subscribe right now and don't miss the moment when everything changes. Where are you looking from? Let us know in the comments. Derek Wilson adjusted the collar of his modest, dark gray jacket as he stepped onto the bustling platform. The sound of shuffling feet, the clanking of luggage wheels, and the distant hum of engines filled the crisp morning air. To most of the commuters hurrying toward their destinations, Derek appeared as just another traveler, an ordinary man making his way onto the train. But his intentions were anything but ordinary. As the newly appointed head of a major railway company, Derek had decided to travel incognito on one of the company's premier routes. It wasn't just an inspection, nor was it some perfunctory visit to see how things were managed. He wanted to experience the journey firsthand, not as a distant executive giving orders from a leather chair in a glass-walled office, but as a passenger among the people, observing the smallest details. Derek's rise to this position had not been easy. From the beginning of his career, he had faced skepticism and prejudice. He had been passed over for promotions, his ideas dismissed, and his dedication questioned by those unwilling to believe that someone like him, black and determined, could rise to such heights. Now that he had reached the top, some of his colleagues still whispered behind his back, their envy thinly veiled as skepticism toward his abilities. But Derek was determined to show that his place wasn't a result of luck or tokenism. It was the result of years of relentless work, discipline, and sacrifice. With a single carry-on suitcase and a ticket he had booked under an alias, Derek approached the gate. The suitcase was well-worn but sturdy, its scuffed wheels bearing witness to countless trips. His clothes, while neat, were intentionally unremarkable. No expensive watches or tailored suits that might give away his identity. He wanted to see the world from the perspective of those he served, without the privilege his title normally afforded him. Derek entered the first-class carriage quietly. The leather seats gleamed under the soft, warm lights, and the subtle hum of air conditioning enveloped the space in a comfortable stillness. Only a handful of passengers were scattered throughout the car. A woman in a business suit engrossed in her tablet, an elderly man reading a financial newspaper, and a middle-aged couple whispering softly to each other. As he settled into a seat by the window, Derek noticed the subtle shift in the atmosphere. Eyes flickered in his direction. The elderly man peered at him over the rim of his reading glasses before quickly returning to his newspaper, the corners of his mouth tightening into a frown. The couple exchanged glances, their expressions flickering between curiosity and quiet disapproval. Derek offered a polite nod to the conductor as the man approached to check tickets. The conductor, however, lingered longer than necessary, scanning the ticket with narrowed eyes. Derek could sense the suspicion, the judgment taking shape beneath the man's neutral expression. "Sir," the conductor said, his voice carrying a faint edge, "just to confirm, this is a first-class ticket?" Derek smiled calmly. "Yes, it is. Everything should be in order." The conductor gave a small, tight-lipped smile that didn't reach his eyes. He seemed unconvinced but unwilling to challenge Derek openly just yet. As he moved down the aisle, Derek could hear the whispers start to spread among the passengers. "Doesn't look like someone who belongs here," the elderly man muttered to his seatmate, loud enough for Derek to hear. The woman with the tablet glanced up, her gaze lingering on Derek for a moment, before returning to her screen with a slight smirk. Derek kept his gaze on the passing landscape outside the window, though he felt the weight of their stares. This wasn't the first time he'd been judged based on appearances. It wouldn't be the last. But it still stung, despite the armor he had built over the years. A young security guard entered the car next, his uniform crisp and his expression set in that detached authority some wear as a badge of honor. Spotting Derek, the guard hesitated for a beat, his gaze narrowing slightly. He exchanged a brief glance with the conductor, who gave a small shrug as if to say, "Keep an eye on him." The guard walked over, positioning himself a few steps away, as if his mere presence was supposed to serve as a silent warning. Derek gave him a brief glance and then looked back out the window, unwilling to give the situation more energy than it deserved. But he knew what was coming. Moments later, a businessman seated 2 rows ahead turned in his seat to address the conductor. "Excuse me," the man said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Are you sure this man is supposed to be here? I mean, you have protocols, don't you?" Derek remained still, listening as the conductor returned to his side. "Sir, I'll need to see your ticket again," the conductor said, though there was a slight smugness in his tone now, as if enjoying the opportunity to assert control. Derek handed over the ticket with a calm smile, his composure unshaken. He wasn't surprised. "Ah," the conductor said, scanning it once more. "Must be a gift, then." His voice dripped with insinuation, and a few of the passengers chuckled quietly. One of the businessmen leaned closer to his companion, smirking. "Guess they're handing out charity tickets these days." Derek said nothing, only gave the conductor a steady look that made the man shift slightly on his feet. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken tension. The conductor eventually returned the ticket, his forced politeness cracking under the pressure of his own prejudice. "If you need anything, well, let's just say we'll be around," the conductor said, not bothering to hide the condescension in his voice. Derek inclined his head slightly, accepting the ticket without a word. His expression remained calm, though inside he could feel the familiar knot of frustration tightening in his chest. It was the same knot he had felt throughout his life, at every checkpoint, every barrier, every moment when someone made him feel like he didn't belong. The train began to move, the scenery outside shifting from the crowded cityscape to open fields and distant hills. Inside the first-class carriage, however, the atmosphere remained heavy with tension. Derek could feel it pressing down on him, each whisper and sideways glance a reminder that, in their eyes, he was an outsider. The whispers grew louder as the journey continued. One passenger leaned across the aisle to another, exchanging loud remarks about how some people just don't know their place. A well-dressed woman, sipping from a delicate china cup, gave Derek a cold once-over before returning to her conversation, deliberately turning her back toward him. Despite the hostility, Derek remained still, his gaze fixed outside the window. The landscape rushed past in a blur, but his mind was sharp, cataloging each moment, each insult, and each assumption. He knew this wasn't just about a train ride. It was a test of his patience, a measure of the prejudice that still lingered in places where it had no business existing. As the train sped along the tracks, Derek allowed himself a small, private smile. "Let them think what they want," he thought. "They'll find out soon enough who I really am." And so the train continued on its journey, carrying with it the weight of unspoken truths, hidden identities, and the slow simmer of a conflict that had only just begun. Derek sat still, his gaze unfaltering as he looked out the window, the rolling fields blurring past. On the surface, he maintained an air of calm detachment, but inside, each passing minute heightened the tension. Every snide remark and dismissive glance from the other passengers chipped away at his patience. It wasn't the first time he had encountered such prejudice, and it wouldn't be the last, but this situation felt heavier somehow. The train's confined space magnified every insult, and the hours ahead promised to stretch painfully long. He leaned back into his seat, exhaling slowly. From the corner of his eye, he noticed the security guard still stationed nearby, watching him with thinly veiled suspicion. Derek couldn't help but reflect on how even his modest attire, intended to keep him anonymous, had backfired. To these passengers, his very presence was a disruption, a reminder of their deeply ingrained biases. Across the aisle, the murmurs continued to grow louder, no longer masked as whispers. A well-dressed man with silver hair, one of the wealthier passengers, sneered openly. "Doesn't seem like the type to afford first class," he said, nudging his companion, who chuckled in agreement. Derek shifted slightly but didn't respond. The old anger stirred within him, a familiar frustration he had battled throughout his career. It was the same frustration he had felt when colleagues doubted his competence, assuming that his achievements were unearned. Yet here he was, the head of the very company that operated this train, enduring the same dismissiveness from strangers. The conductor returned, strolling leisurely through the aisle as if to remind Derek of his presence. "Comfortable, sir?" he asked with a hint of sarcasm, glancing at Derek's modest suitcase resting by his feet. Derek gave a brief nod. "Quite." The conductor's smile was brittle. "Good to hear. We want everyone to enjoy their journey, especially those with special tickets." The passengers around them snickered. Derek said nothing, though his jaw tightened imperceptibly. He knew better than to give them the reaction they sought. The tension in the carriage escalated when a new group of passengers boarded at the next stop. Wealthy men and women, their designer luggage wheeled in by attendants. They settled into their plush seats, exuding entitlement. It didn't take long for their attention to land on Derek. One of them, a man in his 40s with an air of superiority, noticed Derek sitting quietly and smirked. He jingled some coins in his hand, his expression dripping with mockery. "Here," the man said, tossing a few coins toward Derek. "That should cover a cup of coffee, if they serve it in plastic cups where you usually ride." The coins clinked against the floor, one of them rolling under Derek's seat. A low hum of amusement rippled through the carriage. Derek's heart thudded steadily in his chest, but his expression remained calm, composed. He leaned forward, slowly, gathering the coins with deliberate care. Holding them up for a moment, he let them fall into the pocket of his jacket without a word. His quiet defiance was met with smirks and sneers from the surrounding passengers. The conductor, standing nearby, made no effort to intervene. In fact, he seemed to take pleasure in the unfolding scene, as though the humiliation of Derek validated his own prejudices. "Some people just can't help themselves," the conductor muttered, loud enough for Derek to hear. It was a statement loaded with contempt, and Derek knew it was meant to provoke him. Yet he remained silent, knowing that any confrontation would only confirm their assumptions about him. Instead, he let the insult hang in the air, unresolved, like a sharp note that refused to fade. As the train rolled on, the passengers grew bolder. A well-dressed woman leaned over to the conductor, speaking loudly enough for others to hear. "Are you sure he belongs here? I mean, there's economy class for a reason, isn't there?" The conductor chuckled, feeding off the crowd's energy. "We checked his ticket. Seems he got lucky." Derek's grip tightened around the armrest, but he forced himself to remain still. The hostility was palpable, radiating off the passengers in waves. He knew these moments too well, how prejudice could snowball when unchecked, how small slights could quickly escalate into something more dangerous. The tension reached a new level when the conductor, emboldened by the passengers' approval, took things a step further. During a stop at a remote station, he discreetly bent down and punctured one of the wheels on Derek's suitcase with a small, hidden tool. The quiet hiss of escaping air was barely audible over the hum of conversation. When the train resumed its journey, Derek discovered the damage. He lifted the suitcase, feeling the deflated wheel drag against the floor. The message was clear. "You don't belong here, and we'll make sure you know it." Derek's mind flashed back to the many moments in his career when he had been tested, when promotions had been withheld, when colleagues had undermined him, when he had been forced to prove himself again and again in ways others never had to. He remembered the sleepless nights, the endless work hours, and the quiet resolve that had carried him through every challenge. Now, here he was, in the first-class carriage of a train he technically owned, being treated like an intruder. But Derek knew better than to lash out. This was a different kind of challenge, one that required patience and restraint. He reminded himself of the bigger picture, why he had come on this journey in the first place. Suddenly, one of the passengers, an older businessman, leaned forward, locking eyes with Derek. "You look like someone who's used to being in the wrong place," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before sitting where you don't belong." Derek met the man's gaze without flinching. "Maybe next time," he replied softly, "you'll realize that the world doesn't belong to people like you." The businessman blinked, caught off guard by Derek's calm, measured response. For a moment, the carriage fell silent, the tension hanging thick in the air. But the silence didn't last. The group of wealthy passengers exchanged glances, their expressions shifting between irritation and confusion. They didn't know what to make of Derek. His quiet defiance didn't fit their narrative. He was supposed to be angry, humiliated, broken. Instead, he was composed, unshaken. The conductor, sensing the shift in mood, tried to regain control. "All right, folks, let's settle down. We've got a long journey ahead of us." But Derek could see the cracks forming. The passengers weren't as confident as they had been a few moments ago. His refusal to react the way they expected had unsettled them, leaving them unsure of how to proceed. And so the train rumbled on, carrying its cargo of prejudice and entitlement toward an uncertain destination. Derek knew the journey was far from over. There were more challenges ahead, more insults to endure. But he also knew something else. He had already won the first battle, simply by refusing to play their game. He leaned back in his seat, the damaged suitcase resting at his feet, and allowed himself a small, private smile. Let them think what they want, he thought. They'll soon learn the truth. The wheels clattered rhythmically against the tracks, a steady beat that mirrored Derek's resolve. He was ready for whatever came next, and no matter how much they tried to push him down, he would rise above it. The train jolted violently, causing passengers to lurch forward in their seats. A shrill squeal filled the air as the brakes engaged abruptly, grinding against the tracks. Conversations halted mid-sentence, and confusion swept through the first-class carriage. The train shuddered once more before coming to an unsettling stop in the middle of nowhere. For a moment, silence reigned, broken only by the nervous shifting of passengers. Derek Wilson sat up straighter, his gaze sharpening. Outside the window, the landscape stretched into endless fields, empty and desolate. No station in sight. Something was wrong. The murmurs began almost immediately. "Why have we stopped?" a woman's voice demanded from across the aisle. The conductor reappeared, pacing nervously down the carriage, trying to maintain a semblance of calm. But the subtle shift in his body language gave him away. He had no control over the situation. Derek noticed the conductor's clenched jaw and unsteady hands, clear signs of someone unprepared for a crisis. "We seem to be experiencing a minor technical issue," the conductor announced, his voice brittle under the weight of the passenger's stares. "Please remain seated while we assess the situation." His words did little to quell the rising panic. A man in a tailored suit scoffed loudly. "Minor? We're in the middle of nowhere. What's the real problem?" Several other passengers voiced their complaints, their frustrations mounting with each passing second. The temperature inside the train began to drop, adding another layer of discomfort. "Do we have any heat?" someone shouted from the far end of the carriage. "Why isn't the staff doing anything?" another chimed in angrily. Derek could feel the tension spreading like wildfire. The once contained hostility that had been directed solely at him now found new targets: the conductor, the train crew, and even the situation itself. Panic had a way of exposing people's true nature, and this was no exception. The conductor fumbled with his radio, trying to contact the engineer at the front of the train, but only static greeted him. He cursed under his breath, the thin veneer of professionalism slipping further with each failed attempt. Derek sat silently, observing the unfolding chaos. It was a familiar sight, disarray born out of poor leadership and a lack of preparedness. He had seen it many times before in his career, but this time he wasn't just a distant executive reviewing reports from his office. He was right in the middle of it, experiencing the failure firsthand. "Why is no one giving us answers?" a passenger demanded, standing up and glaring at the conductor. The conductor held up his hands, trying to placate the crowd. "We're working on it. Just give us a moment to sort this out." But the crowd wasn't buying it. The cold was creeping in, and the lack of communication only fueled their anger. Derek knew it wouldn't take long for the situation to spiral out of control completely. He could already see passengers shifting blame onto one another, their patience wearing thin. The wealthy businessman who had tossed coins at Derek earlier leaned toward the conductor, his face twisted with annoyance. "You're supposed to be in charge. Do something." The conductor stammered, We're waiting on instructions from the front." Derek could sense the man's authority unraveling, thread by thread, and when leadership faltered, chaos thrived. With a calm, deliberate motion, Derek rose from his seat. All eyes turned toward him, some with disdain, others with curiosity. He straightened his jacket, picked up his deflated suitcase, and began walking toward the front of the train without saying a word. "Hey, where do you think you're going?" the conductor called out after him, irritation laced in his tone. Derek paused, glancing over his shoulder. "To see what the real problem is." The conductor scoffed. "And what makes you think you can fix it?" Derek's gaze was steady. "Because someone needs to." He continued walking, leaving behind the conductor's indignant muttering and the passengers' confused stares. As he made his way toward the engine, he could feel the weight of their expectations, some mocking, others begrudgingly hopeful. It didn't matter. Derek knew what needed to be done, whether they believed in him or not. He reached the front of the train, where the engineer and a few crew members were huddled over the control panel, exchanging frustrated whispers. They barely noticed Derek's approach until he spoke. "What's the situation?" Derek asked calmly. The engineer glanced up, startled. "Who are you?" "Someone who can help," Derek replied without missing a beat. "What happened?" The engineer hesitated for a moment, then gestured to the control panel. "The electrical system failed. We've lost power to most of the train, and we can't establish radio contact with dispatch. Heating's down too." Derek nodded, taking in the information quickly. "Have you checked the emergency circuits?" The engineer frowned. "We were about to, but let me," Derek interrupted, stepping closer to the controls. His voice was calm but authoritative, leaving no room for argument. The crew exchanged uncertain glances, but stepped aside, allowing Derek to inspect the panel. His hands moved with practiced precision, flipping switches and checking circuits. Years of working from the ground up had given him knowledge most executives never bothered to acquire. Within minutes, Derek identified the issue. A power surge had tripped the system, cutting off communication and heat. It wasn't a catastrophic failure, but it required manual reset procedures, something that would have gone unnoticed by untrained staff. "We need to reset the main relay," Derek said, turning to the engineer. "It'll restore partial power and allow us to reconnect with dispatch." The engineer blinked in surprise. "You know all that just by looking at the panel?" Derek offered a small smile. "I've spent enough time on these trains to know how they work." Without waiting for further questions, Derek guided the crew through the reset process. Switch by switch, the lights flickered back on, and a low hum of heat returned to the carriage. The communication system sputtered to life, and the radio crackled with static before stabilizing. "This is train 502, the engineer called into the radio, relief evident in his voice. "We've restored power and are back on track." Derek exhaled quietly, feeling the tension ease from his shoulders, but his work wasn't done yet. He needed to make sure the passengers were safe and calm before the situation spiraled any further. He made his way back through the carriages, the hum of restored power following him. As he entered the first-class section, the passengers stared at him in stunned silence. The same people who had sneered at him earlier now looked at him with something resembling confusion, and perhaps a trace of respect. "What did you do?" the businessman asked, his tone less condescending now. Derek set his suitcase down and met the man's gaze evenly. "I fixed the problem." The conductor, who had been standing awkwardly by the door, shifted uncomfortably. How did you even know what to do?" Derek gave him a long, steady look. "Because I've been here before." The passengers exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier hostility now replaced by a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. Derek didn't linger on their expressions. He had done what needed to be done, regardless of their opinions. As the train resumed its journey, Derek returned to his seat, his deflated suitcase resting quietly beside him. The tension in the carriage had shifted, not entirely gone, but no longer directed at him. For now at least, the crisis had been averted. But Derek knew that the real reckoning was yet to come. The train glided smoothly down the tracks once again, the restored hum of the engine bringing with it a palpable sense of relief. Conversations, which had been fraught with panic and anger moments ago, now softened to murmurs. Some passengers huddled beneath blankets, warming their hands as the heat began to circulate properly. Others sipped lukewarm drinks handed out by the staff, finally settling after the disruption. But in the first-class carriage, The atmosphere remained thick with tension. Eyes flicked towards Derek Wilson as he returned to his seat, his calm presence now a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. The passengers who had ridiculed him earlier were quiet, their smugness replaced by uncertainty. The conductor stood near the door, fiddling with the brim of his hat, his eyes darting between Derek and the other passengers. He cleared his throat awkwardly, trying to reassert some control. "Well," the conductor said, raising his voice to gather attention, "looks like we've got everything under control now." He glanced toward the businessman who had thrown coins at Derek earlier. "No harm done, right? We're back on track." A murmur of agreement spread through the carriage, though it was accompanied by a few embarrassed coughs. The conductor took a step forward, clearly aiming to salvage his image. "I appreciate your patience, folks. We got it sorted." A voice cut through the uneasy silence. One of the train crew members, a younger man who had worked alongside Derek during the crisis. "Actually," the young crewman said, addressing the passengers, "it was him who sorted everything." He pointed directly at Derek. "He's the one who fixed the relay and got the power back on." The conductor's smug smile faltered. His eyes widened slightly as the realization set in, but he quickly masked it with an awkward chuckle. "Ah, yes, of course. He was, helpful." Derek's gaze remained steady as the conductor spoke, offering no sign of resentment or satisfaction, but there was a subtle shift in the air, an acknowledgement, unspoken but undeniable, that the man they had belittled had saved them all. The businessman who had mocked Derek earlier leaned back in his seat, uncomfortable now under the weight of his own behavior. His bravado, once so confident, had evaporated. Clearing his throat, he addressed the conductor with forced nonchalance. "Well, good to know someone knew what they were doing." The conductor, eager to move on, gave a weak chuckle, but the tension in the room lingered. He turned toward Derek, clearly grappling with how to acknowledge what had just transpired without losing face. "So, I suppose we owe you some thanks," he muttered reluctantly. Derek remained composed, not allowing any emotion to creep into his expression. "I didn't do it for thanks," he said evenly. "I did it because it needed to be done." His tone was calm but carried an undeniable authority, leaving little room for further patronizing remarks. The awkward silence that followed stretched for a long moment, heavy with the unspoken weight of regret and guilt. The conductor shuffled his feet, clearly struggling with what to say next. Finally, he straightened his uniform, as if trying to reclaim some dignity. "Look," the conductor began, awkwardly rubbing the back of his neck. I might have misjudged you earlier. It's just things get busy, you know? And, well, sometimes you make assumptions." His words stumbled out, each one more strained than the last. Derek didn't respond immediately. He let the conductor's discomfort hang in the air for a beat longer, knowing the importance of this moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "We all make mistakes," Derek said, his voice steady but firm. "The question is whether we learn from them." The conductor shifted uncomfortably under Derek's gaze. There was no anger in Derek's expression, but there was a quiet resolve that made the conductor feel smaller than he ever had. For a fleeting moment, the conductor seemed ready to argue, but the weight of his actions caught up to him. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging. "I'm sorry," the conductor said at last, his voice low. "I shouldn't have treated you the way I did." It wasn't a grand apology, nor was it eloquent, but it was genuine. And for Derek, that was enough. The businessman, now clearly feeling the pressure to follow suit, awkwardly leaned forward. "Yeah. Look, I guess I owe you an apology, too," he said, rubbing his hands together nervously. "Didn't mean anything personal back there. Just thought you didn't belong." Derek gave the man a long, measured look. "You thought wrong," he said simply. The businessman swallowed hard, nodding in acknowledgement. He knew there was no excuse that could justify his earlier behavior. The other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their expressions a mix of guilt and shame. They had all played a part in the earlier hostility, whether by actively participating or by staying silent. Now, faced with the truth of who Derek was, or at least who they thought he might be, they realized how deeply their prejudices had clouded their judgment. The conductor, still struggling to find his footing, turned to Derek again, this time with genuine curiosity. "Who are you, really?" he asked quietly, as if finally sensing that the answer mattered far more than he had initially realized. Derek met the man's gaze steadily. "I'm someone who believes that people deserve respect," he said, "whether they wear a uniform, a suit, or something else entirely." The conductor nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of Derek's words. There was a lesson buried in those words, one that would linger long after the train reached its destination. As the train continued down the track, the tension in the carriage began to ease. Apologies, though hesitant, were exchanged between Derek and the other passengers. The walls of prejudice that had loomed so tall only hours before now began to crumble, piece by piece. Derek leaned back into his seat, letting the rhythmic clatter of the train soothe the remnants of tension in his own mind. He knew that the journey wasn't over, not just the literal one, but the journey toward breaking down the prejudices that still clung to places like this. But for now, at least, the first steps had been taken, and sometimes that was all it took to set things in motion. The conductor lingered near the door, casting occasional glances toward Derek as if trying to make sense of the man before him. There was still a lingering curiosity in his eyes, but now it was accompanied by something else: respect. And though Derek didn't seek recognition, he knew that in moments like these, respect had a way of planting seeds that could grow into something greater. With the train gliding smoothly toward its next stop, the passengers settled into their seats, quieter and more introspective than before. Apologies had been made, lessons learned, at least for some. Derek allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. He had come on this journey to observe, to learn, and to understand, but in the process, he had done something more. He had shown these people, through actions rather than words, that respect could not be bought, demanded, or forced. It was earned. And in the end, he knew that was the only recognition that truly mattered. The train glided smoothly toward its final destination, the rhythmic clatter of wheels creating a steady pulse in the background. In the first-class carriage, the passengers sat in awkward silence, their earlier arrogance replaced by introspection. Derek Wilson remained seated, quietly observing the subtle shifts in behavior. The passengers, who had openly mocked him, now avoided his gaze, their faces tinged with guilt. Even the conductor stood near the door, looking as though he wished to disappear into the upholstery. Derek glanced at his watch. The train would arrive in less than an hour, and he knew the time had come to address what had happened. The journey had been more than just a ride. It had become a lesson, one that he needed to ensure did not go to waste. Rising from his seat, he adjusted his jacket and turned toward the passengers, addressing them with calm authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice cutting through the low hum of conversation. "I'd like to take a moment of your time before we reach our destination." All heads turned toward him. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others sat up straighter, sensing the importance of what he was about to say. As many of you know, we experienced a disruption during this journey. Derek continued, his tone measured. The technical issue we encountered was serious, but it was resolved through teamwork and quick thinking. The conductor swallowed hard, clearly expecting some form of reprimand. Derek let the silence linger for a moment before continuing. However, he said, his gaze sweeping across the carriage, what happened here today was not just about a mechanical failure. It was about something deeper, something that requires us all to reflect on how we treat one another. A murmur spread through the carriage, but Derek raised a hand and the murmurs ceased. I am Derek Wilson, he said, his voice steady but firm. I'm the new head of the railway company that operates this train, and I've spent years working my way up from the ground level to get here. The announcement landed like a stone dropped into a pond, sending ripples of shock through the passengers. The conductor visibly paled, realizing just how badly he had misjudged the situation. I chose to travel incognito today, Derek explained, because I wanted to see firsthand how our staff and passengers interact. I wanted to understand the challenges and opportunities we face, without the filter of titles or formalities. He paused, allowing his words to sink in. The passengers looked at one another, their earlier arrogance crumbling under the weight of his revelation. And what I've witnessed, Derek continued, has been eye-opening. I've seen kindness from a few, yes, but I've also seen prejudice, entitlement, and disrespect. Not just toward me, but in the way we allow our assumptions to shape how we treat others. He turned his attention to the conductor, who stood frozen, unable to meet his gaze. I'm not here to humiliate anyone, Derek said, but I am here to set a new standard, one that ensures every person who boards one of our trains is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of how they look or where they come from. The conductor shifted uncomfortably, guilt etched across his face. I didn't mean for things to go that way, he stammered. I wasn't thinking. Derek held up a hand, silencing him. What matters now is not what you meant, but what you'll do moving forward. He turned to the other passengers, ensuring his message reached everyone. The same goes for all of us. Today was a lesson, a reminder that respect is not a privilege reserved for a few. It's a basic right. A hush fell over the carriage, the weight of his words settling over everyone like a blanket. I will be implementing new policies, Derek continued, to ensure that our staff understands the importance of treating every passenger fairly. There will be accountability at every level of this organization. The conductor looked at him, visibly humbled. I understand, sir, and I'll do better, I swear. Derek gave a small nod. I believe in second chances, but let me be clear, there won't be a third. The conductor nodded vigorously, gratitude and relief evident in his expression. Derek turned back to the passengers. I appreciate those of you who took a moment to reflect and offer apologies, but let's not stop there. Let's take what happened today and learn from it. That's the only way we move forward. There was a moment of silence, and then the businessman, the same man who had tossed coins at Derek earlier, stood up awkwardly. He cleared his throat. For what it's worth, he said, I'm sorry. I acted like an idiot. I won't forget this. Derek gave a nod, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Thank you, that's all I ask. One by one, the passengers offered their apologies, some quietly, others more formally, but each one was sincere. The weight of prejudice that had lingered in the air at the beginning of the journey now began to lift, replaced by a shared understanding of the importance of respect and accountability. Derek glanced at the conductor one last time. "Gather the staff when we arrive," he said. "We'll need to discuss how we improve from here." "Yes, sir," the conductor replied, standing a little straighter, ready to follow through. As the train neared its destination, Derek returned to his seat, feeling a sense of fulfillment. He hadn't just observed the system, he had changed it. And while there was still work to be done, he knew that today marked the beginning of something better. The train pulled into the station, the passengers gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. As Derek rose from his seat, he caught the eye of the businessman one last time. "Safe travels," the man said, with a genuine smile this time. "You too," Derek replied, lifting his worn suitcase and stepping into the aisle. The doors slid open, and the passengers began filing out, their conversations softer and more reflective than they had been at the start of the journey. Derek stood by the exit, watching them go, knowing that each person carried with them the lessons learned on this train. And as the platform came into view, Derek allowed himself a quiet moment of satisfaction. Today had been a success, not just because the train had reached its destination, but because the people on board had, too. He adjusted his jacket, lifted his suitcase, and stepped off the train. The journey wasn't over. There were still more tracks to lay, more lessons to teach, but for now he knew he had made a difference. And that, he thought with a small, contented smile, was the only destination that truly mattered. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the story, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. There's plenty more where that came from. Check out our other videos and dive into more gripping stories. And hey, where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Stay tuned because the next chapter is just around the corner.